Welcome to another CarbonCurious session. Today we're going to be talking about the Emissions Reduction Plan 2, which has just recently been released, or at least the discussion document for it has been released for consultation and feedback is being collected. I think the actual plan is due around about the end of the year. My name is Nick Butcher. I'm the CEO of CarbonCrop, and I will be giving you a bunch of our thoughts on it today and sort of some commentary around just what's included. Yeah, that's me. Questions, as usual. We had a lot of questions in advance of this one, so there'll be quite a lot to cover, but there is a Q&A function within Zoom, so if you have questions as we go through, please throw them in that little dialog box. All right, straight into it. So the ERP, I thought it'd be useful to start off with a bit of sort of framing of the terminology and timing for a whole heap of these different mechanisms, because there's a lot of terms and a lot of names, and they all cover different dates and they all have different numbers next to them, but they do all relate to each other. There is method behind the madness. So one of the things which sets some of the weird current date sort of weird idiosyncrasies is the second phase of the Kyoto Protocol, which ran from 2013 to 2020. I think this was possibly supposed to run from 2013 to 2018, and then another one running from 2018 to 2022, hence the timing of some of New Zealand's internal budgets, and perhaps it got changed when Paris was introduced. But either way, the Kyoto period ran to the end of 2020. And Kyoto is no longer a thing in effect. It's now been replaced by the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement took effect from, I think it actually took effect from like 2016. That was when it was agreed in 2015, came into, the treaty signatories came into effect in 2016. But the sort of, what it designated was that signatories had to come up with collections of targets that they would subscribe to. These were called nationally determined contributions, like how much you think you as a signatory to the Paris Treaty, being a state, should do. And you're supposed to sort of revisit these periodically and increase the ambition of them over time. So that sort of the idea being that you could start out, say, we'll do at least this much, and then every now and then, sort of in some cases it's annually, in some cases a bit less than annually. I think the idea was that there was sort of this roughly 5-year ratcheting period that people would come back and like present in front of all the signatories the new amount that they were going to try and do to increase the ambition of their climate change mitigation activities. But the first concrete set of commitments around these were the NDC 1 commitments. And I think some countries are doing these as a point-year commitment, like they say where they will be by the end of 2030. For New Zealand, we've said that we will be by 2030 at a level of emissions, net emissions, which are 50% below our 2005 gross emissions. And I won't get into the debate over whether that's appropriate or not. That's what the target is. But we've expressed that as a multi-year budget. And our budget covers the period from end of 2020 through to end of 2030, so a 10-year period. And it's 571 megatons of CO2 equivalent net. NDC 2 will cover the next 10-year period, and importantly, we don't actually have a commitment yet. I don't think anybody else does either, but it's pretty soon that we're supposed to indicate that commitment. So I think around the end of this year-ish. I mean, I think we're probably likely to be sometime early in 2025. But this is what we've said to the international community we will do. The emissions budgets are what we are planning to have available, or the budget that we're trying to meet on a domestic level. So these are broken up slightly differently. I'm not sure why emissions budget 1 didn't start until the start of 2022, but for whatever reason it does. And that's why if you look at emissions budget 1 versus emissions budget 2, it might look a little bit like we're going in the wrong direction, because emissions budget 1 is 290 megatons, emissions budget 2 is 305 megatons, but EB1 is for a shorter period. So the annual emissions, and again, these are net emissions, are dropping over time. And we've already set out to the end of emissions budget 3. So EB1, 72.5 per year, EB2, 61 per year, EB3, 48 per year. And this is down from, I just looked earlier, our actual emissions as assessed by MFE for the 2021 year was 77 megatons. Underneath this are the emissions reduction plans. So these are the plans for how we will achieve these budgets. We're coming to the end of the ERP1 period, and I think this is in accordance with the Climate Change Response Act. The an ERP2 has to be released by no later than 1 year before the start of the period that the emissions reduction plan is for. So that's the end of 2024. So the document that's just come out is the discussion document on a consultation for what's proposed to be included in that emissions reduction plan 2, which, to repeat myself, is the plan for how we will achieve the emissions budget 2. And these emission budget 1 plus emission budget 2 is sort of how we will achieve the domestic component of our nationally determined contribution. And they're not exactly the same thing, which is important, and I'll get to in a moment. Finally, if you're an ETS participant who has some forest, the numbers that you're probably mostly thinking about are the mandatory emissions reporting periods. These used to kind of be designed to line up with the Kyoto period boundaries, I think was the intention behind it. And so the whole thing with the end of 2022, which many of you will be conscious of was an important date, was associated with the end of MERP3. And also important to note that we're currently in a short MERP, which is colloquially called the mini MERP. And that runs until the end of 2025. And the reason that short one has been introduced is to try and synchronize these sort of subsequent periods. It's possible that I haven't quite lined up the boundaries quite correctly here and the dates are a bit off, but EB3, ERP3, and MERP6 are all 5 years long. If that's not actually the case, it's because when I was dragging these boxes around, I got the alignment a little bit off. And then underneath all of this are two things. One is the international, what is it? UNFCCC, and that's sort of the international group which underpins the International Panel on Climate Change, which is what developed the Paris Treaty, which we are a signatory to, and then we have the Climate Change Response Act, which is intended to get us to net zero for long-lived gases by 2050 and a 24 to 47% reduction in methane. I think it's biogenic and waste-sourced methane by 2050. So that's sort of the framework things which all of this is directed towards trying to achieve. Reading the ERP2, you could be forgiven for thinking that the ER in it stands for everything. It is not just about forestry. It covers pretty much everything that there is that could contribute to New Zealand's emissions position and also which might be impacted economically by actions that New Zealand takes to try and achieve its emissions goals. Most of the images throughout this presentation are direct screen captures from the ERP document, the discussion document. I've tried to note when they are and when they aren't. If it doesn't look like something that comes from the document, often it's our commentary. I make no concrete assurance over which is which. Please don't take me as speaking for the government on any of these topics. This is mostly our interpretation referencing their sources. At the very top level, obviously the current government has been sort of expressing their general policy objectives in terms of targets, and there is a target 9, which is associated with these climate change mitigation activities. So it's to reduce net greenhouse gas emissions, and it is the 9th of 9. And it focuses on reducing net gas emissions to have us on track to meet our 2050 net zero climate change targets, which we have to do because, well, at least the government has to do according to the current Climate Change Response Act, which is a law that you have to do this in New Zealand, and also to hit our emissions budgets for the next 2 emissions budget periods, being the one that we're in now, 2022 to 2025 of 290 megatons, and the 305 megaton one from 2026 to 2030. So it remains government policy that we will try and hit that emissions budget. Here we get onto our budget versus our NDC. Our budget for the period covered by our NDC is 672 megatons, and that makes up a combination of our emissions budget 2 for the 2026 to 2030 period, our emissions budget 1 for the 2022 to 2025 period, and our actual emissions from 2021, which we didn't have a budget for, but they're still included in the scope of the reporting. So that's 672 megatons. Our nationally determined contribution, which is what we say we will achieve, sort of the broader we, which includes New Zealand and whatever international collaboration it is involved with, is less than that, 571 megatons, meaning there's a 101 megaton gap between what our budget was and where we think we're going to get to. There are some additional policies in, I think it's in ERP2 alone, which are expected to reduce the actual emissions versus our budgeted emissions to the tune of 9 megatons over, or 8 megatons over that period. But it still means that we've got a shortfall forecast under current policies of 93 million tons for the combination for our NDC. And the way the NDCs work, at least in principle, is that to the extent that we don't achieve our NDC through national mitigation activities, we should partner internationally through various mechanisms to achieve the remaining mitigation activities that we've sort of missed by. So somehow we need to help someone else achieve 93 megatons worth of emissions reductions if we don't find a way to achieve some more of that ourselves. Often that help will come in the combination of both sort of perhaps some sort of technical support in various forms and partnerships, but usually dollars transferred as well. There have been a number of numbers thrown around. I've seen estimates as high as $20 billion. I don't think those are particularly credible. The range that I've got here, which is more in line with what I've seen sort of recently used, is at the $5 billion end. That's roughly the price of this mitigation within our current ETS, under the current ETS price, a little bit higher, but sort of same ballpark. And it's also roughly the price that Switzerland, for example, who already has these partnerships in place for achieving international mitigations activity, has been paying for the sort of assignment of those mitigation outcomes to Switzerland, sort of 25 to 30 US dollars a ton. At the higher end of the spectrum, $12 billion, that is the amount that we would have to pay at today's market price if we bought 93 million tons worth of emissions mitigations or units essentially on the EU ETS. So the EU has an emissions trading scheme similar in many respects to New Zealand. One of the ways that New Zealand's rules, and I think the IPCC rules, say that you can sort of achieve your NDC is by buying an equivalent quantity of emissions reductions that will lead to a reduction in overall emissions within another economy. So either way, though, it's going to cost us a lot of money. You might ask why we're not budgeting to actually hit our commitment. Like we're saying that our budget is to basically end up falling short by 93 million tons. So our plan, our emissions reduction plan, and our emissions budget, is like the plan is what we do domestically to hit our budget. So we are aiming to come in within budget. But our NDC is what we, being the slightly broader we and whatever international collaborations we have in place, are looking to do internationally to hit our share. So essentially, New Zealand's assessment is that doing our fair share in terms of climate change mitigation involves doing more than we can realistically do domestically over the first NDC period, which is, okay, sorry, I just repeated myself there. So you might think that this is great and like, yeah, go team, we're all one planet, etc., etc. It is good that we are looking to be ambitious, but it's not especially good that we are coming in short domestically to the tune of 93 million tons, because firstly, it relies on these other countries actually doing more to the tune of 93 million tons. And as you start to get sort of a bit closer to the, forgive the expression, but the coal face, obviously we don't want a whole lot more coal, but it's easy to be cynical about exactly what form those international mitigation activities will take and just how credible they'll be. The government does have a policy that we will prioritise environmental integrity in any international project partnerships that we have, but when you look at some of the other ones that do exist internationally, I'd say that generally our domestic activity is of higher integrity than the average international mitigation activity at the moment. The other thing that it means for our economy is that there's going to be a whole lot of money flowing overseas, like absent any other mechanisms, that would be $5 billion, and that goes straight onto our current account deficit, which is a lot of money for an economy the size of ours. I think our current account deficit is something on the order of, I'm not actually sure, I think it's around $30 billion, so it's a lot. Like, you put that $5 billion in the context of what we earn annually from dairy exports, if you want to get a sense of how much it means. Upshot of this is that we should be very actively trying to find ways to do more domestically for multiple different reasons. I would say that our current budgets are, I hesitate to say that they're insufficiently ambitious because it's not necessarily going to be trivial to hit them, but I think that we shouldn't be doing the thing that it's trivial to do. We should be trying to find a way to be really ambitious and decarbonize really quickly. But obviously we need to align this with sort of the global level of ambition and make sure that we're not just sort of deliberately setting ourselves up for economic hardship. The government's commentary on this in the emissions reduction plan was interesting. So on top of current proposed policies, there's expected to still be this 93 megaton gap versus the 101 megatons that is versus the current budgets in the NDC. Key quote, the government is considering how to address this challenge and will make further announcements in due course. So one of those announcements could be we've procured 93 megatons of internationally transferable mitigation outcomes from these international partners. My great hope is that some of the announcements will be we've found a way to increase our levels of emissions mitigation within the NDC1 period domestically, and we will need to secure less through our international partnerships. Throughout the NDC document, I'd say this is sort of like, you can see it's figure 1.3. It was fairly early on. And I think it's a good summary of the general philosophy of the emissions or the budget attainment approach is a focus on net emissions rather than just gross emissions, although there are significant reductions in gross emissions anticipated, and a focus on cost-efficient mitigation. This is all pretty controversial. I generally think that it actually makes sense, but there's a lot of views that we should have a much stronger focus on reducing our gross emissions and that relying on carbon removals is risky, etc., etc. I generally think that as long as the removals are of high integrity and they're actually robust and you've got mechanisms to make sure that they're resilient and you don't kind of get your economy into a very difficult position where if your ability to create removals ran out, you would sort of have a massive gross emissions profile that you couldn't reduce. I think it's a pretty good idea to take this approach. Like the thing that matters most from an atmospheric and climate perspective is the net position, not the gross position. The example I keep using is that if we had a machine with a solar panel on the top that spat out like thousands of tons worth of diamonds per hour that were made with atmospheric captured carbon, then we should just, and it was free, then we should just turn it on and put a giant pile of diamonds somewhere and not worry so much about atmospheric CO2 concentration. The issue is that we don't have such a machine. We don't have anything even closely approximating such a machine. There is no way we realistically could or should look to scale carbon removals to the point that we don't care about gross emissions. So we're going to have to massively reduce our gross emissions by necessity to hit net zero. But that's not because carbon removals are bad. That's because carbon removals are scarce and expensive to scale. So usually it's cheaper to focus on gross emissions, at least in some contexts. But this is the whole point of the government's current policy: cost-efficient mitigation. Where it's cheaper to reduce emissions, you do. Where it's cheaper to remove emissions, you do that instead. And the consequence is that you'll be doing both of them to a very large degree. This was more just for fun than anything, and I'm not saying this is particularly representative, but term frequency is always an interesting way to look at the sort of some of the philosophy behind how people are communicating things. So this is a simple phrase count across the ERP document. So the reason I included the top one is just so that you get a sense of calibration of roughly how often words occur that aren't words like if or the in the whole document. So the word climate appears 281 times, which you'd expect for a document on achieving our climate change mitigation targets. The phrase NZETS appears 198 times, which is pretty consistent. If you go through the document, you'll see that the ETS is heavily relied on as a mechanism for achieving the emissions budgets. Market appears 86 times. This is very much about market mechanisms to help achieve our emissions budgets and our emissions reduction goals. And this is where it's really interesting, given a lot of the commentary around the ETS. Confidence 23 times, credible 21 times, credible NZETS specifically as a phrase 6 times, credible market 9 times, and market confidence 3 times. So I think the document very much acknowledges some of the shakes to market confidence and ETS confidence over the last couple of years. And there's at least a strongly expressed ambition to restore that confidence. And I'll speak a little later over how that's going. As far as what's new, these are the key policies proposed for ERP2 and their associated projected abatement for both of the next 2 emissions budgets. So that's 2 and 3, beyond what exists today. I haven't pulled any of these out particularly, although I think they're all interesting. None of them relate to forestry. You'll see agricultural mitigation technologies and emissions pricing in there. the key point there is that that's mitigation, so reductions. It's not about removals. Those are covered separately. Activities that are possibly going to be, I think these were potential opportunities for improvement, or possible policies. They're sort of a lower level of commitment. Here there is one. Firstly, there's a whole heap of stuff on additional agricultural emissions reductions. And this is the first mention that forestry gets in terms of a possible additional policy, which is that the government is looking at the afforestation potential for Crown land. So specifically 5,000 hectares of indigenous in 2027, increasing to 7,500 hectares per year from 2028. And exotic, that's 10,000 hectares per year from 2027 onwards. This is, I probably won't get into the full detail of this given the time that we've got, but this is very interesting for the ETS because forestry on Crown land cannot currently be registered within the emissions trading scheme. So this doesn't directly result in the government earning NZUs and being able to sell those, but it does count towards our NDC. It is recognised in our national carbon inventory, and it does potentially create removal units that the government could choose to use either to offset the emissions for a sector that's outside of the ETS, like agriculture, or to increase the sort of available auction budget within the ETS without messing with the overall unit balance and economics. Like it would still be consistent from a national budget perspective. I would say that the summary for forests within the document is basically preservation of the status quo. And you can see the importance of forestry's contribution. So this is the projected reductions in second emissions for the second emissions budget. It might look here like forestry is delivering 30 megatons of reductions across the period of removals. That's not actually the case. It's delivering 30 megatons of net removals more than it delivered over the 2018 to 2022 period on a net basis. I'd also just note, and I didn't realize this until putting the presentation together, this axis here is distorted. We are not, like the amount by which we're actually reducing is smaller than it looks. This starts here at 200. So just as you're glancing at the picture, do adjust for that. Looking at forestry's full contribution as projected and the growth in it, over the first emissions budget, which was the one that we're sort of finishing up at the end of next year, net 5.9 megatons per year of removals. This is almost more than doubling in the second emissions budget period. And it's important to note that these are mostly trees that are already in the ground. And the shift is either because they're starting to grow more quickly and or the rate of deforestation is dropping. There could be some changes in accounting mechanism in there, I haven't checked. And this is projected to steadily increase through the third emissions budget until finally by 2050, the projection is that our forestry will be sequestering 21.3 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. So I drew that down the bottom here as a big blob versus actual zero to sort of give you some context of it versus our total emissions for the ERP2 budget. The amount of forestry removals projected for 2050 is almost a third of our total emissions across all sectors, including agriculture today. So it's a very big part of the overall decarbonisation strategy. To enable this, we're going to need more forest than we have today. Here you have some projections from the ERP doc of how much more forest, and these are informed by two different surveys, which I think are run I think it's the University of Canterbury primarily who runs them, and they're sort of commissioned by, I think, Tauranga Raukawa. This is the afforestation and deforestation intentions survey. So it's like, who's planning on cutting down on deforesting land? Who's planning on afforesting land? What's the net result of that change? In 2021, the estimate was that the balance would be 38,000 hectares per year in favour of afforestation. By 2023, through a combination of the policy changes and sort of loss of confidence, etc., that net intention had dropped to 18,000 hectares per year, so it had more than halved. As best I can see it, the estimate that's used for the central projection forecast is about 28,000 tonnes, sort of splitting the difference between those two. I would say that's probably optimistic under the current market conditions, mostly because if you do this, you end up with an oversupply of NZUs within the ETS, which will result in price collapse, which is what the Climate Change Commission and others have been talking about for a long time. And the prospective investors in these forests know this. They're not going to invest in an asset where they're concerned about the price dropping. They're going to find whatever the optimum is, where the price is still high enough based on scarcity of supply that it's interesting for them to invest. And that's likely to be at less afforestation than is presented here. But I mean, there's a lot of factors here. Don't take that as any sort of comprehensive statement on future forest planting activities. The government does say at a couple of points later on that they're looking at ways to increase that afforestation. This was the comment from a press release from the NZ Institute of Forestry. Sort of generally praised the content of the ERP in terms of its sort of providing some level of clarity. Did raise concerns about lack of clarity on what the restrictions could be on forestry eligibility for registration, specifically exotic forestry in the coming years, and particularly question the accuracy of the forecasted planted areas for 2024 and beyond. So I'll just read this out for those who are squinting at the screen. Our data suggests the actual planted areas are likely to be significantly lower than the government's projections. Specifically, we estimate the planted areas in 2024 will be approximately half of the forecasted figures, with a greater decline expected in 2025. If you look at this chart, though, the 2024 expectation is around 61,000 hectares. It's certainly, we are not hearing about anything remotely close to that. But 50% of that is around about what the 2025 projection is, so 30,000 hectares and falling to 28. So it's not totally clear to me how big the gap is between forecast and actual intentions at the moment, but I would say that certainly the general market environment has shifted away from mass afforestation of non-forest land, for better or worse. I've also mentioned this before, but one of the recurring themes is the gap in incentives. Basically, this gap down the bottom here are those removals that will be needed to meet the net zero target, but are not incentivized through the ETS. And that's because the ETS doesn't cover this sector. So it's kind of a no-brainer that they're not going to be incentivized by the ETS. They've sort of been deliberately excluded through the ETS design. But if they're desired, then they have to be created through some other mechanism, which could be the planting of trees on Crown land. So I'm now going to do a bit of a quick tour through the policies and an overview. I've highlighted the references to market confidence here, and I was kind of making fun of this earlier and am now, but it's actually, I think, like laudable and really good that the government is putting conscious effort into market confidence. It is very important. If we end up with a volatile ETS price and lack of willingness from investors to undertake activities within the ETS, that's extremely bad for pretty much everybody and is likely to just mean paralysis, lack of action, and then we miss our targets and we have to buy even more units from overseas. So higher or lower, confidence around the price and stability of the price and predictability of the price is an extremely important thing, and it's good that that's being prioritized. Hopefully that sort of follows through into the actual plan and the market really does regain confidence. Key points here: restore confidence in the ETS, give certainty to forestry, support continued investment in afforestation, but it also supports investment in decarbonisation activities. Like, you're much more likely to invest in an electric boiler or an electric furnace or electric heating if you think that the future price of carbon is going to be stable and increasing, than if you think the whole thing is just going to fall over and everybody's going to give up and go home, in which case you can just continue with the status quo at no cost. As to the impact that this actually had, so the ERP2 plan was released, I'm not sure if you guys can see my cursor, but hopefully it's sort of late June. Was it late June? Early June? No, it was more recently. That was about the middle of July. The market didn't react much. There was sort of a brief increase of perhaps 10% or so. It's basically been trading within that range of 50 to 55 over the period, sort of a few weeks prior to and a few weeks subsequent to the release of the ERP. You could argue that this was a failure of the discussion document to restore market confidence, but another way to look at it would be that the market is reasonably confident that things will remain as they currently are. And there's some frustration that that price isn't higher. Certainly it's well below the targets that the Climate Change Commission has identified for sort of rapid, meaningful reductions in gross emissions. But it's what the market and the way markets work is reasonably confident that the price will be for the near-term future, having appropriately modified the price for the risks in both directions. I'd say a good thing is that the price didn't collapse again as it did sort of in was that early 2023? I think, when it sort of dropped down to one point in the low 30s. A couple of key policies. One is that there is the intention to limit exotic forest ETS registration through constraints. you can see the note here. The government expects to release more details on this work later in 2024. This was signalled in the as national party policy in the election campaign, and I think the specifics were basically around limitations on the fraction of exotic registrations that could occur within a farm on land use classes within a certain band. So I can't remember the exact numbers. I think it was something like LUC 5 or below. You couldn't have more than 25% of your LUC 5 or below forest within a farm registered in the ETS as exotic forest. It's not to say you couldn't necessarily plant it, though there are other restrictions on planting, but you couldn't register it. LUC 6 and above, can't remember exactly where the threshold was, it might have been 5 and above. Fill your boots, you can register whatever you like. And for native forest, there was no restriction across any of the LUC classes. So that's working from memory. I may not have it exactly right. And that also may not be what the final actual legislation, regulations, restrictions are. But there's still a clear indication that it's moving in the direction of some restrictions. There was also this reference of, I mean, they didn't say this, but I couldn't resist the alliteration. So public-private planting partnerships. Couple of points from that sort of summary. I'd encourage you to read the whole section, but increased incentives for natives, improved diversity in exotics, which I think is actually an extremely important and admirable thing. A lot of the time when people complain about exotic forest, they're complaining about non-biodiverse exotic forest. If you can achieve biodiverse exotic forest, especially biodiverse forest with a native forest mix, then it sort of can be a way to split the difference between the benefits of natives and the benefits of exotics in a way that's actually economically viable and scalable. Crown land under afforestation, we mentioned before. And then at the end, there's a note that the land that could be suitable is under assessment at the moment by MPI, LINZ and DOC, and that there will be some information released soon, I think. Non-forestry removals were also given a mention. Interestingly, some of the non-forestry removals are actually forestry removals, including the largest likely categories of new activity in my view, aside from carbon capture and storage, which is an important one. So on-farm vegetation, there remains a desire to recognise carbon removals in on-farm vegetation, and specifically here, they're implicitly referring to on-farm vegetation which can't be recognised under the existing ETS rules. There's a lot that can be recognised under the existing ETS rules, including some shelter belts and riparian plantings. It all comes down to geometry and tree species. So here they say the scientific data on how much carbon these types of vegetation can remove are uncertain. Overall, I would say that there's reasonable certainty that the riparian plantings, as they tend to exist today, won't remove a lot. And that's not necessarily because the trees don't sequester much carbon, but it's because the actual areas in question tend to be pretty small. I totally agree with recognition of the carbon removal in those areas of forest. I think that where they've been created, there should be credit given for them. They won't necessarily count towards our nationally determined commitments because of their geometry and our definition of forest. But it's still, if you're going to look at taxing farmers for their methane emissions, it seems reasonable to recognise them and incentivise them for their carbon removals, regardless of the nature of those removals. I won't mention wetlands and peatlands. They're not something that we are significantly involved in or where I think I can add much expertise. Likewise, coastal vegetation, though we are involved in discussions around some mangroves. But a key one that I think is really important and could create a lot of value very quickly is the recognition of ongoing carbon sequestration in forests that existed or were in the process of establishing prior to 1990. That could be through pest control. I think the more promising category is probably through changes in forest management other than pest control, and particularly future harvest and management intentions. But either way, that's in there. It's part of the mix. My view is that that's probably where a lot of our progress towards that 93 megaton deficit is likely to come from. There are another sort of general key comments, which certainly would have helped with confidence for forestry, and I think are generally good, like we want regulatory predictability. Two key things: no vintaging of NZUs. That might sound a little bit cryptic, but basically it means that if you get an NZU for some carbon that your forest sequestered in 2022, it's not going to expire. You don't have to sell it. Nobody has to use it to cancel out their emissions by 2027 or 2028. It's just you can use it in 2050 if you want to. At least that's the implication of this commitment. Also, there was a commitment to no differential treatment of forestry NZUs in the ETS. You may recall the consultation, which I don't actually remember it came out. The times moved oddly in the last decades, but I'm pretty sure this was the early 2023 one, which did lead to a price collapse, where there was a suggestion of potentially introducing a split market for forestry versus the rest of the ETS. Obviously, even talking about possibilities like that is very bad for forestry investor sentiment because they don't know what the future returns on their investment are going to be if they don't have a commitment from the market framework to treat it in a certain way. So this commitment from the government certainly helps in terms of investor confidence for forestry. And then there are a couple of other items here around just generally sending clear signals and generally retaining commitment to the existing purpose of the ETS and the role of the ETS in New Zealand's climate change strategy and the targets of New Zealand's climate change strategy. 10 minutes over, sorry, there was a lot to cover there, and there's probably stuff that I've missed. I certainly encourage people to tell us things that they think are important that they noticed or flag questions. We'll get into questions in a moment to run through. We will also are going to put together a submission in response, somehow fit that in amongst everything else there is to do, and we will share that once it's available. If you're particularly interested in getting a copy of that from us or collaborating, please do get in touch. Thanks very much to everybody for your interest and your attendance. And yeah, enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. We'll be back in touch in another month or so. Cheers.